Welcome to Plant Power. This is the first episode of the newest season of the Holistic Matters Podcast series, where we'll be talking about farming, phytonutrients, and nutrient availability in the context of building plants for human health. In this episode, we welcome our guests, nutrition scientists Weston Bussler and Brandon Metzger. Today, we'll be talking about the whole food matrix. I'll let my co-host Sarah take it from here.
Hi, this is Sarah, Kara, and Megan, and we are talking with doctors Brandon Metzger and Weston Bussler today in regards to the whole food advantage and how that works within the overall aspects of nutrients and supplements. So welcome, Brandon and Weston. I'm really excited to have this conversation today with you in regards to what is the whole food matrix.
Thank you, Sarah, for having us. My understanding of the whole food matrix is really dependent upon, whether it's a food or the preparation that you're delivering a supplement. They both can be a whole food matrix depending upon how the ingredients are prepared or processed. And that's really the definition of whole food, is the degree to which components are removed or isolated to deliver what our body needs in the form of nutrients.
Weston, do you have anything else to add to that kind of definition that is, as you think about the whole food matrix?
Yeah, with that, I would also add in it's that you really look at that physical domain and all those potential interactions that you can have with the thousands and thousands of different metabolites that are present in a whole food. That's something that's, when you look at a food, they're packaged in ways that are relevant for the actual origin of that material's own biological function. So if we're talking about a plant, it's everything, all these different nutrients are packaged together in ways that they're part of functional protein complexes with a mineral at the active site and all these different chains of amino acids creating those peptides or the proteins. And then that in conjunction with all of these additional things, you have almost everything interacting with each other at all times in order to drive these specific functions. But that leads to, as a nutrient source for us, something that is in itself very unique, especially when you look at species to species to species to species. You're going to see a lot of different combinations of these different types of nutrients all packaged together. So that food matrix really creates this very unique aspect to each individual thing. And then when we look at pairing them together, as Brandon's talking about with some of these components, you can create a new food matrix and a new material, but that whole food matrix would be really how it's been packaged together in a way that was done by nature for the specific function.
Before we move on, I want to just highlight how often I heard Brandon and Weston refer to things like complexes and packaging, as well as preparation and processing. These concepts seem very key to understanding what the whole food matrix is, what actions may interrupt the integrity of this matrix, and why understanding the transition is so important.
Yeah, Kara, I think as we think of this whole food matrix, it's really about creating the synergy where the bioactivity of the plants work together and that we utilize the macro and micronutrients to really make a difference in the foods that we consume. And so we need to consume this matrix of food together to make sure that our body has the ability to utilize the plants with the best synergy possible.
I think it's interesting because individual plants have its mechanisms, but we also see that there's an advantage sometimes of putting plants together to create the synergistic effect. So can maybe you guys talk about how the matrix can be an advantage for human health and how that synergy can come together?
Yeah, sure. So, as Weston was discussing, kind of the makeup of what is the whole food matrix. In my mind, I'm thinking of vegetable, for example, of say, carrot. And carrot can be broken down into different sources of nutrients. Some of those more classically known components of a carrot might be its vitamin A content, which actually is derived from a pre-vitamin A molecule that can be then converted into vitamin A. But that's simply just one single isolated component within that carrot. There's obviously all of the other beneficial cofactors and enzymes, and then the larger class, what we call macronutrients, such as the starches and the fiber, the carbohydrates that are there, as well as a fat component. All of those things play some role in the utilization of a specific nutrient like a pre-vitamin A for our body to utilize. And Sarah, your question was really asking more about the combination of other food components for the whole food advantage can be considered much broader. So in fact, if you were to consume, other fruits and vegetables, maybe something more highly enriched in fats or lipids, what the research indicates is that foods higher in fat can help actually the absorption of things like vitamin A molecules or pre-vitamin A molecules, otherwise known as beta carotene, and some of the other carotene molecules in carrots. So definitely like eating a wide diversity of plants and foods works towards building this whole food advantage case, and that you're combining various classes of other phytochemicals and lipids and fibers, all that have some effect on the utilization of the nutrients from whole foods.
Yeah, and just to tack on to that, from a synergy perspective too, those carotenoids, the beta carotene, it functions as an antioxidant, and there's also going to be other types of these antioxidant compounds in something like a carrot. So you're going to have things like vitamin E, the different types of tocopherols, as well as some vitamin C and certain phytonutrients in addition to that. But why those are all important is when you look at something like carrot, it does contain, as Brandon was saying, a certain level of these fats in there, and the fats can be supportive for certain absorption rates. But then you also have these antioxidants in there that are really important for that preservation aspect in the plant and preserving some of these lipids, especially the polyunsaturated fatty acid ones, and being able to stem off oxidative reactions that wind up degrading a lot of those lipids and creating the pro-oxidant as you start to get some of those like more rancidity conditions starting to take hold. So when we try to mimic a lot of these natural forms and create our own foods that are stable, we wind up having to do things like utilize the benefits that you get from something like high vitamin C containing ingredient and pair that with a lot of these others, because then you get that vitamin benefit as well as that effective antioxidant benefit within the food matrix system itself.
Yeah, one other thing I want to mention is often, I haven't classically thought of bacteria as a component of food, but we all know that in the soil conditions and the locations where we grow and harvest food, there is a whole ecosystem of bacteria and other microbiological organisms that support the health and growth of that plant or food where it's located. And those bacteria can actually become an important consideration in the nutrient bioavailability. Just as an example, we know that polyphenols as a class of compounds contain a wide diversity of molecules. Some of those polyphenols, in the case of tannins specifically, aren't very well absorbed from the food supply, whether it's grapes or pomegranates or a tea. But there are very specific types of bacteria located on the food sources that can actually break down or convert those polyphenols into a usable nutrient for our body, or semi-nutrient. Not classically considered a nutrient, but a beneficial, what we call phytochemical for the body to utilize. And without those bacteria, that wouldn't be possible.
Brandon mentioned the ecosystem of the bacteria in the soil, which is so interesting and so relevant to this entire podcast series that we're doing. And in our third episode, we'll actually be talking with organic farm manager Christine Mason, who will dive deeper on this subject.
Yeah, and Brandon also mentioned nutrient bioavailability, and we're excited to have a whole conversation in episode 5, again with Brandon and Weston on this subject. Plus, we'll talk more with Megan and Weston on phytonutrients in episode 4. So if you're listening and you're interested in these topics, Keep listening and stay tuned for upcoming conversations. Okay, back to our interview.
I think that's a really interesting concept about the idea of bacteria. We've also seen the idea of improving bioavailability, and we'll talk more about bioavailability in depth in a few episodes. But, is that you can do it through bacteria, but then there's also some really interesting work out there that has been done in North Carolina, protein to improve bioavailability too, right, with polyphenols.
Certain proteins and such, they wind up being able to complex very nicely with a lot of different phytonutrients, a lot of these different phenolic compounds. And in particular, some of the research I believe you're referring to is having to do with that fact that you can wind up taking a really high quality protein source from some kind of plant base, so be it any sort of protein type, and then you can wind up attaching some of these phenolics that are present in high concentrations in a lot of different plant materials. Certain things can then be used, like you can create some kind of a really nice shelf stable polyphenol delivery system. And what's interesting when you do compare it to the living organisms is those haven't isolated that and done this, but that winds up occurring in the plant on its own. It winds up packaging all these sorts of different metabolites into usable features, and sometimes that does lead to a lot of these different binding occurrences happening.
This kind of leads me to how supplements can do some of these things. We talked about how conventional foods can be part of this matrix, and we've seen in the supplement industry that often that we find isolates. But let's talk a little bit about how supplements can fit into this idea of providing this whole food matrix, and how that combination, either with other things or in combination with other phytonutrients or micronutrients or macronutrients, really fit into this concept of supplementing the overall diet.
Yeah. So Sarah, that's an interesting question. Just thinking about, Weston's collaboration of proteins and say polyphenols and taking that a bit further into the design of, say, a supplement platform. As I see it, there's really 3 defined ways for delivering the whole food advantage in the case of, say, a protein and polyphenol approach, just as an example. So, we just have spent a majority of this time talking about whole foods and what's present in the food for delivering nutrients, and that's naturally present, whether it's a blueberry that naturally has some level of protein, bound to the polyphenols, or some other fruit rich in polyphenols. That's one way. So by concentrating and delivering that whole blueberry, that's one way of kind of delivering the best of both the protein and the polyphenol synergistically to provide for good absorption of those polyphenols. So that's really one way. Another way that supplements are often designed, and sometimes this isn't necessarily completely understood, is that, just packaging together a high protein source, whether that's, a pea protein or a rice protein or some other high quality protein, in combination with a polyphenol extract from raspberries or maybe grapes, the two of those together through the digestion process can become more available. So the combination of 2 foods together, as we've discussed here today. But really, there's a third way as well that is really interesting to me, because it's really founded upon demonstrating through scientific principles of pH and controlled conditions to really generate a new exciting ingredient. And so this is done through process technology, where 2 components can be reacted together in a controlled condition and then prepared as a dried ingredient, sometimes often listed as a branded ingredient, or well studied, well validated through research to showcase that 2 ingredients reacted together, 2 natural ingredients, can sometimes provide an even greater benefit. So that would be a third type of kind of combination of that example of protein and polyphenols.
Mm-hmm. If we think more about how supplements and whole foods, how does that work? People a lot of times think whole foods are like the foods that you eat at dinner, but how can supplements really be part of the whole foods, and what does that look like? And as we parse it out, what are we thinking, as a whole? What does that mean for the consumer and the patient who's taking them?
Certain supplements have a lot of some of the qualities that you would say you have in a food. So an example of that could be some of these larger form powders that are delivered as supplements often. So when you're delivering these larger amounts of supplements, so say you're trying to deliver a high amount of fiber to a person, but you're, instead of using just like a high isolate fiber, you could be delivering a fiber supplement, a particular plant that is known to be very high in fiber. So one good example of that is the beetroot. And a beetroot, once it's dried, you have quite a lot of fiber that is going to be present in that, and being able to be delivered in a high amount, and that can class as a supplement. So now you're delivering fiber in the form of a whole beet as a dietary supplement for an individual, but it's coming in that same form as a whole food. And similar to that, you can say take some of an isolate. So say you have a highly concentrated fiber that's derived from an oats, and this could be a more functional type of fiber. Say it's a high soluble fiber that is something like a beta glucan that comes in oats. So you can pair those together, and then you can get a lot of the benefits of that whole food in with the functional benefits that you see in some of the soluble fibers. Now, these can be, they're always going to be patient dependent considerations that you need to take into account for something like that, because when you are delivering that whole food portion, if a certain person, say they're avoiding some particular type of food for any particular reason, that may be a case where the isolate is preferred by that person. But when you're delivering it with these whole foods, you get the added benefits of those additional vitamins and minerals and things that you would see with the traditional food-based approach. And by combining the two, I think you get a lot of the best of both worlds. In the food world, you can actually eat a lot more oftentimes of certain things. So when you're dealing with the supplement world, sometimes these things could be rather expensive ingredients, and you can only take a few of them at a time because of it being cost prohibitive or something, since the ingredient could be very rare to find. But if it's a food, oftentimes that food is being delivered and you're able to consume 100 grams of an oat. You can consume a really large amount of oats at a meal, but then you're only getting a small subset of that oat is that particular type of fiber, versus in the supplement, you are looking at oftentimes a highly concentrated, either a pure isolate or a concentrated, more crude extract that hasn't been refined, that really delivers a high amount of that particular nutrient or phytoactive in comparison. So when you use that whole food advantage, you kind of get the best of both worlds. You get the forms that your body's used to seeing, as well as you can get some of those higher concentrations that you would potentially need for some sort of actual clinical benefit that you'd be looking for.
I think that leads me to kind of my next ideas and thoughts on this, is that, so if you take, maybe fiber is one component that we want for a variety of reasons, because we know people don't get enough fiber in their diet, but we also maybe want a certain phytonutrient. So how do we process that and make those things more available, or how do we isolate that a bit? I mean, we're not making them into a synthetic, but we're isolating them out so that we can have those therapeutic effects. Brandon, can you maybe talk a little bit about that process? And Weston, if you could just add on as we go through that discussion.
Yeah, sure. So that's a very specific question as it relates to fiber, Sarah. I think, you could take that same question and for different classes of nutrients and come up with 15 different answers. I would say what I know of the fiber world, really you're talking about a broad class of compounds here. So, I mean, to say fiber is, to talk about things like insoluble fiber.
Right.
And soluble and resistant starch and beta glucan. So it's quite a large group.
There's subclasses within each of those classes too, where you have certain types of these fibers that look insoluble, or they are insoluble but they act like a soluble fiber. In case of resistant starch, there's 5 different types of resistant starches, and within those 5 different types there's going to be individual crystalline structures and things. That fiber gets super complicated. That's
right.
one of the things
We should have a whole podcast on fiber. We'll do that next time, right? A whole pod series on fiber, because each of those specific fibers that you guys were talking about, right, have also specific outcomes for the patient that you're looking for. And so you want to have those targeted. Let's talk about a phytonutrient that we're trying to pull from the plant. That might be a better opportunity to have that discussion.
We shouldn't steer away from fiber. I mean, there's definitely some pretty cool things about fiber that make it unique as far as, your question in processing. Right. Fiber is very stable, generally as a type of carbohydrate. It's fairly, in most cases, water soluble. So a lot of fibers can be prepared or concentrated, I would say, to generate a dose that's reasonable, say within a shake or a powder application or even a supplement.
Non-soluble ones are also usually going to be able to be physically separated too via sifting and processing.
Yeah, very good point, Weston. But in general, they tend to be generally well concentrated or prepared through methods of water extraction, and that really brings up a broader kind of point when you want to talk about the processing methods to enrich components of whole foods. Oftentimes that's dictated by its polarity or its affinity towards fat or a water, somewhere on that spectrum or continuum. Its presence along being more fat-like or more water-like will kind of help generate a process for enrichment of that particular nutrient.
Cool. So I think as we continue to dive into this idea, is there things within the processing that can alter, maybe not fiber necessarily, because as you said, Brandon, fiber is pretty stable, right? But could alter either some of the phytonutrients or the micronutrients in the process, that as we prepare to make, supplements that we need to be aware of?
Yeah, so I can address that. I can say firsthand that, the enemies of kind of whole food nutrients are pretty defined. And those things are heat, number one, oxidation. And oxidation has a whole set of circumstances that can increase its damaging effects. Heat is definitely one of those. Light, even things like controlling pH can have an effect on parameters or inputs into the processing on nutrients. And so in my work with preparing ingredients from whole foods, the best way to kind of control that quality and enrich, concentrate those valuable nutrients that we all understand come from food are primarily dealt with, keeping temperature down and keeping the length of time when nutrients are subject to degrading. So oftentimes, if you were to take a group of vegetables and juice them to create a nutrient-rich water fraction, all these vitamins, you would want to consume that fairly quickly, because over the course of being removed from, say, the fiber portion or the protein portion that's in that group of vegetables, things will start to degrade. They're not as stable. So controlling the time that it's in that liquid form and reducing the amount of light and heat, as well as controlling the proper pH, where that vegetable is naturally most stable or the nutrients are most stable, that's the best way to kind of optimize or preserve those nutrients.
Also, one thing to consider when you're doing some kind of a process on a living material like a plant is that when that plant is alive and living, there's actually, everything's really like tightly controlled and regulated, because it's all packaged in how it's supposed to be. But the second you're squeezing it to create that juice fraction, you're doing a couple of things. You're disrupting all of the physical structure. So you're allowing all of this water that was bound within all of these different plant cells and cell walls to be released from in there, and that it releases a lot of different enzymes in the plant that can increase things like spoilage and wind up breaking down a lot of the things. So these plants have a lot of enzymes in them that are designed to deal with all sorts of different environmental interactions. So they may start to break things down immediately. We're all aware when you wind up biting an apple, how it starts to turn brown after a while with with that. That's just one example of you're disrupting that physical matrix structure and allowing for things to now interact, whether or not Brandon's talking about they're interacting with light and interacting with the air and all sorts of different things. But you also increase the water activity and the ability for all these different enzymes or the microbes that are on the plant to start interacting with components that they normally wouldn't see in a living plant.
So, Weston, you brought up an interesting point. So the release of the constituents within the cells of, say, a vegetable with, the bacteria that are naturally present on that vegetable creates a unique ecosystem that, well, when it's understood, it can actually have some positive health benefits. And that's kind of what happens in the case of fermentation. So, another kind of unique attribute of the whole food paradigm is that, when you expand the idea of whole food beyond just, what's in, to go back to the carrot, what's inside that carrot, but also maybe what's living on the carrot and the microbiological niche that it grows in, the combining of those two pieces together can create something totally unique. In the case of processing through breaking down the cells, those two interaction can create new kind of beneficial compounds within the food.
I love some of these fermentation subjects that you wind up seeing. And one of my favorites is always looking at something like cassava. And a lot of the cassava that's grown in Africa, it actually has like this really high cyanide content in it when it's raw. But if you take that and you wind up running it through a natural fermentation process, using those microbes that are living on the plant itself, since it's a root plant, it winds up having a lot of these different types of microbes that naturally live within it. You can allow it to ferment, and what that actually does is it removes a lot of the potential harm that could be caused by high cyanide in the plant itself. It makes it more ready for us to consume. But yeah, that's really specific to the African cassava there.
So is there a case where you, as someone eating something, get different nutrients from, say, eating a raw carrot versus eating steamed carrots?
Absolutely. You thermal changes hugely can impact different nutrients, plant components, like all over the place. Like almost anything that we do to a plant is processing, right? So that's one of the really difficult issues, I think, with processing and getting an understanding around that. So you have this whole food matrix base, and that's the raw plant the raw plants. I wouldn't even necessarily say that processing removes it from being considered whole food matrix. It just each level of processing, and there's different levels too. And there's going to be some minimal processing things that we do that are really going to be important for being able to consume the plant, be it drying it out. If it's something like a spice, that's a type of processing, but it's minimal processing that allows us to use it, and it still has a normal structure to it. But then anything you do to prepare it to eat, say you're heating it up, say you're cooking it in oil, that oil that you're cooking it in, you're actually creating an oil-based extract each time you're doing that to a slight degree. But when you have something like a carrot, certain aspects that Brandon was talking about that in the plant itself that make it a little bit more bioavailable, that fat content in there, by introducing that fat content, that can help extract some of the fat soluble vitamins and help aid in the absorption of those in your body, since your body is absorbing those fat soluble vitamins along with the fat that you're delivering in a full meal. So this is kind of why we always try to tout, eat a high variety of foods and get a well-balanced diet from all these different sources and areas, and not go too far on any one particular thing.
And I think there's a bit of a misconception too, Kara, that, sometimes like raw everything is better, but that's not the case, right? Some nutrients actually do better once they're heated, or there's anti-nutrients and things that if you ate them raw, they would not be helpful for your body.
A lot of these polyphenols that we talk about as positive all the time, historically, those are really looked at as anti-nutrients, because oftentimes these polyphenols are capable of binding a lot of these different minerals that are essential, that we do require for growth, and that were relatively hard to get in our earlier iterations of human life, where we didn't have the ability to fly fresh strawberries or ship fresh strawberries all the way from Chile in the dead of winter and get them into suburban Wisconsin to anybody who wants to consume them. Like, that's absolutely game changing, the ability that we have to just utilize all this technology and all this different understanding that we have of things like nutrition, and just different all types of technology now that we have, that we can put together to figure some of these things out. But it's really interesting, because all the problems seem to change every 50 years. We start fighting completely different problems that we were as a society 50 years previous, unless it's a pandemic, and that shows up every 100 years.
Weston is exactly right when it comes to processing. There are many different types of processing, and while when we hear the term processed foods, we instantly think negatively, there are many different levels of processing that are actually necessary. So there is first unprocessed, which does include the natural edible form of plants and or animals. Then we have minimally processed. So these would be slightly altered, but the nutritional content remains about the same. So for here, you would imagine cleaning or removing inedible parts of a plant, or storing them in the refrigerator, or freezing them, or even fermentation. Then you have processed culinary ingredients, which would encompass the pressing, refining, or milling of foods. And this example would be more in the line with flours or pastas or oils. So then we have processed foods, which is what we commonly hear of and think of. But this is when we are taking whole foods and adding salt, sugar, or fat into it. So one step further then is highly processed foods, and those go above and beyond the additives with extra sweeteners or artificial colors, preservatives to promote shelf life, or aid in texture and palatability. So this is, of course, where we come with cookies and most of the breakfast cereals that we see on our shelves, or frozen dinners or lunch meats. But I think ultimately the key takeaway here is that even if you eat whole foods or are following a plant-based diet, you still technically have some type of processing going on, and not all processing in this instance is harmful. So sometimes you get vitamins added back in if they are lost during processing, or foods may actually be fortified with added nutrients that are not there to begin with. So of course, simply heating or drying a whole food is considered a process. So without sounding like a broken record, if you've heard me talk about this before, but being your own advocate and understanding what you are eating is incredibly important. So learning how to interpret labels and identify what, an emulsifier or colors or thickeners are, or opting for perhaps a more minimally processed diet is still going to be the way to go. But understanding the definition of what processing really means is a whole part of that education. As we think about, the processing and bioavailability and how this whole food matrix works into, the conventional foods we eat, but then also the supplements, what are some last parting words, Weston, that you would give? And then I'll ask the same thing of you, Brandon.
I think it's really interesting how we can, through food, take a bunch of different whole food matrices, put them together, and make one super mix of whole food matrices all together. So you have things coming from all sorts of different foods to create one particular, or all sorts of living things to create one particular dish. And then when we're consuming that at meals, we're consuming it with 4 or 5 other things that then on top of that, you're consuming all sorts of different types of matrices throughout the day, throughout the week. Just the sheer massive amount of different types of metabolites and compounds that we wind up exposing ourselves to on a daily basis is so fascinating. And we are still always trying to figure out so much more about all these different things. And we're at the cusp right now, I think, of a really exciting era where certain things are getting cheaper. we're able to collect all this data of all the different research that's been done over all these years. And now we're starting to answer a lot of these questions that have plagued us for such a long time as to what's healthy for us and how do we maximize our health potential. And this is where we look at our diet as the key thing that we can control. And that's just so cool when you look at a whole food matrix and connecting those dots and figuring out what to do next.
That's true, right? That connection of dots is so key. Brandon, what are your thoughts on this whole food matrix as final kind of parting words, and how, to Weston's point, we're really connecting those dots to make a difference in people's health?
Yeah, so the whole food matrix, as we've kind of talked about through this discussion, to me, it really goes back to defining, what is food. And so if you really start there and ask that question, what is food? You can think about, through time, we've chosen different foods. We live in an era now where foods tend to be more refined, and it's more selective as to the types of foods that we eat. But in general, throughout history and throughout civilization and different cultures, there are all different types of food sources, and those things may come from, what we consider to be good for you fruits and vegetables. But let's not stop there. I mean, let's remember that other sources of food can be, things like nuts and dairy products and meat-based or organ tissue meats, as well as, things derived from the sea. So, marine lipids from fish and even seaweed, fermented foods. All of these things classically define what food is. And so when I think about food and the benefits of that, I look at kind of what I eat on a week-to-week basis, and a lot of those things are missing in the diet, either because of time or just the lack of knowledge on preparing those sorts of foods, or where to buy them or where to get them. But what's really unique about whole food supplements is that because of the opportunity nowadays of gathering ingredients or growing them with a regional farm, we can expand kind of the option of all of those nutrients and phytochemicals that we typically wouldn't get in a weekly meal, now can be added on top of our diet in the form of supplementation. Something that's truly unique and kind of interesting to think about, the wide diversity of ingredients and phytonutrients that you're getting on top of your regular. Hopefully, you're eating good every week and getting most of your nutrients through your food, but now you're adding on top of that with good whole food nutrition sourced really from around the world.
Well, thank you, Weston and Brandon, for such a robust conversation about the whole food matrix. We learned a ton and we appreciate your time. And this is Sarah, Kara, and Megan, and we want to thank everyone for joining in today.
Hi everyone, Dave Hogsed here, and I hope you enjoyed that presentation about the whole food advantage. I've been using whole food supplements in my practice for 20 years now, and I love learning more and more about why patients get such great results with whole food nutrition concentrated into supplement form. It never ceases to amaze me how the simple foods like the beets and the carrots we heard mentioned today are always revealing more and more of their hidden treasures. And that's why I really appreciate the research that brilliant minds like Brandon and Weston put into uncovering as many of the benefits of these foods as we possibly can. Studying the whole food advantage is truly humbling, because when you think you know everything there is to know about a certain food, sure enough, there's a brand new health benefit you never expected. And it really does teach us to be humble, because whenever we think we know what the really important nutrient is in a food, a brand new one is always discovered. And the simple carrot mentioned today is a great example. The main nutrient people used to focus on as the important nutrient in carrots was, of course, beta-carotene. So when people had access to beta-carotene supplements, they thought they were getting the main benefit of carrot, or the most important benefit of carrot. But more and more nutrients and phytochemicals have since been discovered in carrots. I've had a poster in my office for about 10 years now that has hundreds of nutrients and phytochemicals listed that are all just found in carrots. But now, even that poster is grossly outdated because one of the most recent and very powerful benefits discovered in carrots are the phytocannabinoids that help support the endocannabinoid system. The endocannabinoid system wasn't really fully discovered or articulated till 1992. And now we're understanding that this system has broad-reaching and a powerful influence on every organ and every system in our bodies. And now we also know that a simple carrot has cannabinoids that greatly benefit this system. So it's a reminder to always stick with food. You may think you know all the nutrients, all the benefits of a food, but that whole food matrix that's so complex is always working in the background with thousands of nutrients and many phytochemicals, and many of them haven't even been discovered yet. So speaking of the endocannabinoid system, history always seems to repeat itself. And now that we know all these benefits of the endocannabinoid system, we're making the same mistake that we've done with synthetic vitamins like beta-carotene. The isolate supplement that's all the rage for supporting the endocannabinoid system now is, of course, CBD oil. That's viewed as the all-important cannabinoid. But when you use a whole food extract like hemp oil, there are many, many cannabinoids that all work together to support balance in this complex system. And since we're just learning the complexity of all these cannabinoids and how they work together and how they influence the endocannabinoid system, why not trust the wisdom in nature that's found in the whole food complex that's also in hemp oil? When are we going to learn the whole food advantage? It's so simple. You know, as Brandon was discussing the pre-vitamin A in carrots being better absorbed with fats and the synergy of carrots with other vegetables, I thought about the traditional wisdom of nutritional pioneers like Dr. Roy Lee that recognized the value of combining plant-based nutrients like the pre-vitamin A in carrots with foods that contained active vitamin A retinol like cod liver oil, butter, and organ meats. And think about that kind of combination, synergistic combination, just for supporting eye health, just that one issue. The carrots have the carotenoids, lutein, zeaxanthin, and cod liver oil has the active retinol, vitamin A, DHA, and EPA from fish oil for eye support. So one of the biggest advantages of using whole food supplements is the synergy that combining all of these superfoods have in the body. I also loved how Brandon brought up an essential but often forgotten component of what makes the whole food matrix so effective: the bacteria in the soil. People are more aware than ever before about the benefits and advantages of using food as our best source of vitamins, minerals, and other nutrients. But people forget the soil that the food is grown on has to be whole as well. So with all the benefits we know should be in things like carrots and beets, the soil conditions have to be just as nature intended for that carrot to provide all its benefits, not just containing the right minerals, but living organisms. And in podcasts coming up, we'll look closer at the importance of organic farming techniques to ensure the maximum soil quality, which translates into maximum food effectiveness, which translates into maximum whole food supplement effectiveness. In listening to this podcast, I also had a renewed appreciation for another forgotten factor that determines the effectiveness of whole food supplements, and that's the processing. Hearing Brandon and Weston describe all the factors that can degrade the nutritional potency of foods like heat, oxidation, and all of these other factors, it reminded me why so many companies do choose to use synthetic vitamins and isolates as their primary supplements. It's a lot easier and a lot less factors to consider. Basically, a lot less work. It's a complicated business making whole food supplements, and I'm so thankful for the people that are willing to do it right. So in the next podcast, our experts are going to help simplify the complex topic of GMOs. Can't wait to see you there.
Thank you for listening to the first of 6 episodes that comprise Plant Power, the 4th season of the Holistic Matters podcast series. Stay tuned over the next month or so for weekly episodes on Wednesday morning. Want more from Holistic Matters? We've got a variety of other podcast series for you to check out. Plus, articles, videos, infographics, and more on holisticmatters.com. That's holistic with a W.